Karen slaps elderly veteran for sitting in her seat at coffee shop. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a crisp morning in the local coffee shop, the kind of morning when the sun barely broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the bustling streets outside. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the sound of the espresso machine hissing and the chatter of patrons as they queued up to order their usual drinks. The cafe, though not large, was a sanctuary for many, a place where regulars gathered to start their day with the warmth of a latte or a strong cup of black coffee. It was a community of sorts, the same faces coming and going, all forming unspoken bonds over steaming cups and shared moments of silence or conversation. For Karen, it was more than just a coffee shop, it was her domain. She had come to rely on it as part of her routine, the one place where she could claim ownership of a little corner of the world, a place where she could settle into her seat each morning, the spot by the window where she could watch the world go by. Karen had been coming to this coffee shop every morning for years. The barista knew her by name, and the staff knew exactly how she liked her coffee: extra shot of espresso, almond milk, no foam. It was a simple pleasure, but it was hers. This was her space, her time, and no one dared infringe upon it. She arrived early, always before the rush, before the crowd of commuters and students began to pour in, filling up the tables and making it harder to find the solitude she craved. But today, as she stepped inside with her usual brisk stride, she was met with an unexpected sight that immediately soured her mood. There, sitting at her table by the window, was an elderly man. He wore a faded military cap, the kind that was a testament to his years of service, and his hands, though weathered, gripped a coffee cup with the calm steadiness of someone who had seen much in life. The man, likely in his late 70s, was hunched slightly, but his presence in the chair by the window was a stark violation of Karen's unspoken territory. She felt her blood begin to boil as she walked further into the cafe, her eyes fixed on him as though he were an intruder in a place that had long been her own. The man sat there, completely unaware of her growing frustration, engrossed in his coffee and the soft hum of the morning around him. Karen had always believed that certain places and routines were hers to own. The coffee shop, her favorite table, and the time spent in solitude were sacrosanct. It didn't matter that there were other tables in the cafe, that the space could accommodate dozens of people, or that the man had every right to sit wherever he pleased. To Karen, there was a fundamental injustice in someone else occupying her spot, and that injustice needed to be corrected immediately. She could feel the irritation rise in her chest as she stood for a moment, staring at the man. He had no idea that he had just crossed an invisible line, one she had carefully marked with years of habit and entitlement. Her gaze shifted to the counter, where the barista was busy preparing drinks, and then back to the man, sitting peacefully in her seat, oblivious to the storm brewing behind his back. The frustration simmered within her, building to the point where she could no longer hold it in. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she approached him. The sound of the door closing behind her and the light chatter of customers seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered was reclaiming her space. Without a second thought, Karen slapped the table, the loud noise reverberating through the quiet cafe like a thunderclap. The man jumped slightly, his coffee shaking in his hand, but he didn't look up immediately. He was lost in the quiet of his morning routine, perhaps reflecting on memories or simply enjoying the warmth of his cup. But the moment she struck the table, the attention of the few other patrons in the cafe turned toward her. Karen's face was flushed with impatience, her body tense with the expectation that this interruption would be rectified. "Excuse me, but that's my seat," Karen barked, her voice sharp, cutting through the soft hum of conversation. The elderly man slowly looked up, his eyes taking a moment to focus as he adjusted to the sudden intrusion. He didn't appear flustered or even bothered, but his gaze shifted from Karen's angry expression to the table, as if he were processing the request in a daze. He opened his mouth to speak, but Karen wasn't finished. "I sit here every morning. It's my spot," she continued, her words dripping with a sense of ownership, of entitlement that had long been nurtured by routine. "You need to move." The man's face, lined with the years of experience and wisdom, softened with a kind of gentle confusion. He seemed to take in her words slowly, as if he couldn't quite understand why she was so upset. His hands, weathered from years of hard work, lowered the coffee cup slowly, placing it gently back on the table. He offered her a small, almost apologetic smile, though it was clear he hadn't yet fully grasped the cause of her agitation. "I'm sorry, dear," he said in a soft, raspy voice, looking around the cafe, as if uncertain where he had gone wrong. "I didn't know this was your table. I'm just enjoying my coffee." His calmness only seemed to fuel Karen's anger, as though the very fact that he wasn't reacting the way she expected was a further irritation. He was too relaxed, too unconcerned, as if her demands didn't matter to him at all. His nonchalance about the matter, the simple fact that he had chosen to sit where he had, seemed to mock her sense of entitlement. She had always taken for granted that this table, this exact spot, was hers, and this man's peaceful enjoyment of it was a personal affront. "Move!" Karen snapped again, her patience completely gone. Her hand reached out and slapped the table once more, louder this time, the sound startling the man and making his coffee slosh over the side of his cup. As his hand instinctively reached to steady the mug, Karen's next words came with the sharpness of someone who had long been used to getting her way. "You're holding up everyone. Just get up." At this, the elderly man's face shifted from confusion to something a bit more hesitant, and he slowly began to rise from his seat. His movements were slower now, stiffened by age, and he seemed to hesitate for a moment as he stood. His hand rested on the back of the chair, and his gaze met Karen's with a sense of quiet resignation, but there was no anger in his eyes, only the weariness of a man who had perhaps learned to let go of small battles in life. It was then that Karen, not satisfied with the pace at which he was moving, reached out and placed her hand firmly on his arm, her fingers tightening with an almost aggressive force. "Move faster," she hissed, her voice seething with impatience. She gave his arm a sharp shove, pushing him toward the row of other tables as though she were trying to hurry him along. The elderly man's face, once calm and gentle, now tightened with a fleeting look of discomfort. His body stiffened as her hand pressed harder against his arm, and for the first time, his expression wavered. "Please, there's no need to," the man began, his voice low, but Karen wasn't listening. The sight of him, slow, unhurried, seemingly unbothered, only enraged her further. The patrons around them, now fully aware of the unfolding situation, exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the scene Karen was causing. The barista, having witnessed the entire exchange, hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to intervene. The noise from Karen's outburst had rippled through the room, drawing attention from every corner of the cafe. But Karen wasn't done yet. She had demanded the space. She had made her point. And the elderly man, with his slow movements and gentle apologies, was not enough for her. He was just another obstacle in her mind, a symbol of the world she believed should yield to her wants. She could see it in his face now, the weariness of someone who had lived through too much to care about petty disputes. "Just leave already," she muttered under her breath, as if the mere act of moving him had somehow vindicated her. The elderly man, without further protest, shuffled slowly to another table, taking his cup of coffee with him. He did not look back at Karen, nor did he react to the humiliation she had just inflicted on him. He simply moved on, content to find another seat in the crowded coffee shop. And as he settled down at a new table, his actions seemed to speak volumes to the watching customers, the silent victims of an unprovoked act of entitlement. Karen, on the other hand, stood still for a moment, watching him, but her victory felt hollow. She had won the seat. She had gotten what she wanted. But the satisfaction that usually accompanied such victories, especially in public, was missing. It was as if she had forced herself into a win that felt less like a triumph and more like a hollow victory, leaving her wondering if the cost of the battle was really worth it. The coffee shop had returned to its usual morning rhythm, though it would never be quite the same for the elderly man or for Karen, whose actions had shattered the calm. The sounds of clinking cups and the hum of the espresso machine resumed, but the memory of what had just happened lingered in the air like a quiet aftertaste. And Karen, standing by the window, realized that even in winning her small battle, she had lost something far more important, the respect and understanding of those around her. Karen stood there for a moment, watching the elderly man slowly rise from the chair, her hand still lingering in the air from the force of the slap she had delivered on the table. The noise of the impact still rang in her ears, and her pulse quickened with the sudden rush of adrenaline that had surged through her during the outburst. She had done it. She had reclaimed what was rightfully hers, or so she thought. The table by the window, the one she had sat at every morning for years, had been restored to its rightful owner, and that, in her mind, was justice. But as the elderly man shuffled away to another table, the initial satisfaction she had felt began to fade, replaced by an uncomfortable weight in her chest. She wasn't sure what it was, but something gnawed at her, something she couldn't shake. The man hadn't even protested, hadn't argued, or fought back. He had simply accepted her demands and moved to another seat, and Karen couldn't help but feel that it hadn't been as satisfying as she had expected. She watched as he moved slowly, carefully, his hands gripping the edge of the chair for support. His movements were deliberate, cautious, and though his face was calm, there was a faint weariness in his expression, a tiredness that seemed to weigh heavily on him. The faint lines on his face and the military cap perched on his head spoke of a life lived with duty and service, yet his eyes were full of quiet resignation as he slowly found a new table. He didn't look back at her, his focus remained on the simple task of settling down with his coffee, and Karen felt a pang of guilt she wasn't sure how to process. The moment had passed, but something inside her lingered. She had forced him to move, but in doing so, she had lost something as well. It wasn't just the space in the coffee shop, it was something deeper, something intangible, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Karen stood frozen for a few seconds, unsure of what to do next. She had been so sure of herself when she slapped the table, when she shouted at him to move. The discomfort she had felt when she first walked into the cafe and saw someone else sitting at her table had quickly boiled over into anger, and she had acted impulsively, without thinking of the consequences. But now, as she watched the man settle into his new seat with such quiet grace, it became painfully clear that she hadn't taken the time to understand the full picture. She had just reacted. She hadn't stopped to consider that the elderly man, probably in his late 70s or early 80s, might have had more pressing things to worry about than a table in a coffee shop. She hadn't considered that his morning routine, his daily escape, might have been just as important to him as hers was to her. For a moment, Karen felt a flicker of doubt that she quickly suppressed. She had reclaimed her space, and that should have been enough. But instead, she was left with a lingering unease, like the taste of something sour after eating a meal that was supposed to be enjoyable. The rest of the coffee shop seemed to return to normal, with people continuing their conversations and baristas preparing drinks, but Karen could feel the quiet undercurrent of tension in the room. A few patrons had watched the scene unfold, and though no one had openly intervened or commented, she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. There were no overt signs of disapproval, but she knew the looks had been there, the slight shifting of glances, the nervous coughs, the way some people seemed to turn their focus elsewhere as if to avoid getting involved. She could almost hear the unspoken judgments in their silence. The elderly man, having taken his seat at the opposite end of the room, now seemed to be completely detached from what had just transpired. He had regained his composure, his hands gently cupping the warm coffee mug, his gaze soft and unfocused as he looked out the window. But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something about him had been disturbed. His peace, his quiet confidence, had been fractured by her own impulsive actions, and she wasn't sure how to reconcile that with the sense of entitlement she had felt earlier. As she approached the counter to order her usual, Karen's mind was still spinning. She tried to focus on the simple task of ordering her drink, an extra shot of espresso with almond milk, no foam, but her thoughts kept returning to the elderly man. What right did she have to demand he leave his seat? Why had she been so insistent on reclaiming a space that wasn't hers to begin with? In the quiet moments when she allowed herself to question her actions, she realized that her behavior had been rooted in something deeper than just a love for routine or a preference for a specific seat. It had been about control. The coffee shop was hers, her morning ritual was hers, and the idea of someone else encroaching on that territory had triggered a deep, visceral response. It wasn't just about the table, it was about a need to assert dominance over her own little corner of the world, a need that she had never fully acknowledged until now. The barista, a young woman who had seen Karen come in every day for as long as she could remember, handed her the coffee without a word, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Karen took the cup, its warmth radiating through her fingers, but it didn't bring her the comfort it usually did. She thanked the barista absent-mindedly, her mind still occupied with the events that had just unfolded. As she turned back to the room, her gaze instinctively sought out the elderly man, but he was no longer visible from her vantage point. His head was bowed slightly as he stared at his coffee, lost in his own thoughts, completely unaware of the inner turmoil Karen was experiencing. Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of disquiet gnawing at her. She had won the battle, but had she really won? She had taken back her space, but in doing so, she had disrupted someone else's peace. And that thought lingered in her mind as she stood there, staring at her coffee. Was this what she wanted for herself, a victory that left her feeling hollow, a sense of control gained at the expense of someone else's dignity? She couldn't answer that question just yet, but she knew deep down that the way she had treated the elderly man didn't sit well with her. The guilt was there, creeping into her consciousness, making it hard for her to enjoy the routine she had so carefully curated. As she sipped her coffee, Karen tried to focus on the people around her, the conversations, the sounds of the espresso machine, the quiet murmur of voices that filled the cafe. But every time she glanced over at the man in the military hat, sitting at his new table, she felt a pang of regret. He was no longer her problem, but the discomfort he had stirred in her was still there. The moment had passed, but the impact of her actions lingered. She had taken his seat, and in the process, she had lost something far more important, her own sense of peace. The coffee shop was still hers, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Karen sat at her usual spot by the window, the coffee now lukewarm in her hand, but the satisfaction she usually derived from her morning ritual was absent. The bright sunlight that poured in through the glass seemed too harsh today, too glaring for the fragile tranquility she had built over the years of coming here. She stared at the bustling street outside, the cars passing by, the people walking briskly to work, and the occasional cyclist weaving through traffic. The world was moving, going about its usual business, and yet, in the quiet of the coffee shop, Karen felt something gnawing at her, a sense of discomfort, of unease that she hadn't felt before. It wasn't just the man. It wasn't just the fact that he had been sitting in her seat, the space she had claimed for herself in this little corner of the world. No, it was something deeper, something that she had failed to recognize until after the moment had passed. She had acted without thinking, without considering the full picture, and now she was left with the lingering weight of her actions, the regret that came with realizing she had crossed a line she didn't even know existed. She had demanded that he move, had slapped the table, raised her voice, and even gone as far as to physically touch him, all over a seat that, in the grand scheme of things, wasn't truly hers to claim. As she sat there, trying to push the guilt away, her eyes kept drifting toward the elderly man. He had settled at a table near the back of the room, but she couldn't quite block him out of her mind. His movements had been slow, deliberate, as he had carefully chosen another spot to sit. He hadn't fought back, hadn't shouted at her or argued, but she had seen the faint flicker of discomfort in his eyes, the brief moment when he had hesitated, as if he were unsure why he was being asked to move. It was in that fleeting second that Karen realized how wrong she had been. The man hadn't done anything to deserve her outburst. He hadn't even known that he was encroaching on her territory. All he had wanted was to enjoy his coffee, just like she had. And in that moment, Karen had become the aggressor, the one who had disrupted his peace. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup, but it did nothing to ease the tension in her chest. The usual comfort she found in her morning routine had evaporated. The taste of the coffee was bitter now, a reflection of the sourness that had taken root inside her. She had always prided herself on being in control, on asserting herself in spaces that she felt entitled to. But today, that control had backfired. It hadn't given her the satisfaction she expected. Instead, it had left her questioning herself, wondering whether she had done the right thing. Her victory, if it could even be called that, felt hollow, meaningless. As Karen glanced over at the elderly man again, she saw that he was still sitting at his new table, his coffee cup raised to his lips, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the window. There was a peacefulness about him, an acceptance of the situation that Karen couldn't comprehend. He had been forced to move from the spot he had chosen, had been publicly humiliated by her outburst, and yet here he was, sitting calmly, as if none of it had mattered to him. The contrast between their two reactions was stark. Karen had made a scene, had allowed her frustrations and sense of entitlement to dictate her actions, while the man had simply accepted the change without making a fuss. There was a quiet dignity in his response, one that made Karen feel small, petty, even childish. She took another sip of her coffee, but it did nothing to quell the storm brewing inside her. She hadn't wanted to cause harm, hadn't intended to make the man feel uncomfortable. But that was what she had done. Her sense of entitlement, her belief that this space, this table, was hers by right, had clouded her judgment. In the heat of the moment, she had failed to see the man's humanity. She had reduced him to nothing more than an obstacle in her way, someone to be moved for her own convenience. And for what? A table. A seat. Something that, in the grand scheme of things, didn't matter at all. Her eyes fell to the table in front of her, the surface smooth and unblemished, just as it had been every morning she had sat there. She had claimed it as her own, a space where she could be alone with her thoughts, where she could enjoy the calm before the storm of the day ahead. But now, as she sat there, it felt empty, as if the table itself had somehow been tainted by her actions. She had made it hers at the expense of someone else's comfort, and now she couldn't help but wonder whether the small victories she had fought for over the years were worth the cost. Was the right to this seat really more important than treating others with respect, with kindness? Karen shifted in her chair, uncomfortable with the realization that was beginning to settle over her. She had always prided herself on being a reasonable person, someone who understood boundaries, who knew how to navigate the world without stepping on others. But now, she was beginning to see that her sense of entitlement had led her astray. She had treated the elderly man as if he were an inconvenience, a disruption to her routine. She had slapped the table, shouted at him, and even physically touched him, all because she had felt a sense of ownership over something that wasn't truly hers. She had treated him like an obstacle to be removed, and in doing so, she had become the one who had crossed the line. Her eyes wandered over to the man again. He was still sitting at his new table, still enjoying his coffee with the same quiet calm that had initially irritated her. Karen felt a wave of shame wash over her as she realized just how far she had gone to assert her own sense of control. The man hadn't deserved any of it. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had simply chosen a table in a coffee shop, just as she had done countless times before. And yet, in her mind, that choice had somehow become a threat, a challenge to her space, and she had reacted with aggression. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to anyone else who had witnessed the confrontation. As the minutes ticked by, Karen found herself growing restless. She had no idea what she had hoped to accomplish by making the man move, but now that it was done, she didn't feel any better. She hadn't gained anything from the exchange except a growing sense of discomfort, a feeling of emptiness that she couldn't quite shake. She had made her point, but at what cost? The victory she had anticipated now felt shallow, meaningless. She had reclaimed her seat, but in doing so, she had lost something far more valuable, her own sense of integrity. Karen glanced at the man one last time, and this time, when their eyes met, she saw something different. It wasn't anger or resentment, but something more akin to understanding. He wasn't looking at her with judgment, nor was he holding onto the moment like she was. He had simply moved on, accepting the situation without letting it affect him. His quiet dignity, his willingness to let go, made Karen feel small. It made her realize just how petty her actions had been. And for the first time, she found herself wishing she could undo what had been done, take back the harsh words and the slap that had come with them. But she couldn't. The moment had passed, and the damage had already been done. Karen took one last sip of her coffee, the taste now bitter on her tongue. She had gotten her seat back, but in the process, she had lost something far more important, the respect she had once taken for granted, the understanding that had allowed her to move through the world without causing harm. It was a small loss, but one that weighed heavily on her heart as she sat in silence, staring out the window at a world that seemed to move on without her. The minutes ticked by as Karen sat in her chair, the stillness of the coffee shop around her amplifying the sense of discomfort that had settled deep within her. The sun, which had been gently streaming through the window when she had first arrived, now seemed harsher, its rays piercing through the glass and casting long shadows across the floor. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting from the window to the counter and back again, but no matter where she looked, her thoughts kept circling back to the elderly man who had been forced to move from his spot, the same spot she had claimed as her own. His face, calm and weathered, remained etched in her mind, a reminder of the quiet dignity he had displayed despite the public humiliation she had subjected him to. Karen tried to focus on the ambient sounds of the coffee shop, the clinking of cups, the low murmur of conversations, but nothing seemed to cut through the weight of her thoughts. It was as if the space around her had become suffocating, each passing second filled with the rising tide of guilt and regret that had slowly begun to consume her. She glanced over at the man again. He had settled into his new seat without complaint, his hands cradling his coffee cup as he looked out the window, lost in his own thoughts. He had accepted the situation without protest, without anger, and that made Karen's own emotions feel more tumultuous in comparison. He hadn't given her the reaction she had been expecting. She had anticipated resistance, an argument, perhaps a defiant challenge to her authority over the table. But instead, he had simply moved, and now, his peaceful acceptance seemed to mock her impatience, her selfishness. The more Karen tried to justify her actions, the more the guilt gnawed at her. She had been in the wrong, she knew it now, and there was no escaping that truth. The victory she had expected, the sense of triumph from reclaiming her space, had dissolved into a hollow emptiness that left her feeling like a child who had thrown a tantrum and gotten what she wanted but, in the process, had lost something far more valuable. She sat for what felt like an eternity, her coffee now cold in her hands, the cup growing heavier with each passing moment as if the weight of her actions were being transferred into the ceramic. The warmth she had once felt from the drink was gone, and in its place, there was only the bitter aftertaste of her behavior. She didn't know what she was waiting for, an apology from the man, perhaps, or some form of acknowledgement that he had wronged her by sitting in her seat. But as the minutes stretched on and the sound of the espresso machine hummed in the background, Karen realized that she wasn't going to get that. The elderly man hadn't shown her any malice, hadn't raised his voice or demanded an explanation for her actions. He had simply moved, as if he had no need to make a scene, as if he didn't want to engage in a battle for something as insignificant as a coffee shop table. And that realization struck Karen like a bolt of lightning. What had she done? What had she truly gained from making him move? Nothing. Her gaze shifted to the other patrons, some of whom had been present during the confrontation. Their eyes avoided hers now, some pretending to focus on their own drinks, others looking away entirely, as though they hadn't witnessed what had just happened. There was a certain awkwardness in the air, a silence that Karen could almost physically feel pressing down on her. She had been so certain that she was in the right, that her actions were justified, but now, in the aftermath, she felt the weight of their judgment, their unspoken disapproval. The quiet had grown thick with discomfort, and Karen realized that, for all her outward confidence, she had lost something far more important than a seat by the window. She had lost the respect of those around her, and most painfully, she had lost the respect she had once held for herself. The elderly man, still seated in his new place, had barely moved since he had relocated. He didn't seem angry, and there was no visible sign of distress in his demeanor, but Karen could tell that he had been affected by the interaction. He had been forced to move, to relinquish the space that had been his without question. It wasn't about the table anymore. It wasn't about the seat. It was about the way she had treated him, the way she had treated another human being with such dismissiveness, as though he were nothing more than an inconvenience to her routine. And now, as she sat there, the full weight of what she had done began to sink in. She had humiliated him, made him feel like he didn't belong in the very place where he had come to enjoy his morning. She had taken his peace from him, and for what? A seat that wasn't even hers to begin with? Karen's thoughts began to swirl, each one pulling her deeper into the realization of her own failings. She had always prided herself on being a reasonable person, someone who understood boundaries, who could see the needs of others even if they weren't voiced. But today, she had let her sense of entitlement cloud her judgment. She had taken for granted that the seat by the window was hers and hers alone, and in doing so, she had violated the basic principle of respect for others' space. The man hadn't done anything wrong. He had simply chosen a spot to sit and enjoy his coffee, and in her eyes, that had become an offense. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how ridiculous she had been, how small her world had become in her need to control every aspect of it. The coffee shop had grown busier as the morning rush continued, and the sound of the espresso machine became more frequent, the chatter of the patrons louder. But Karen couldn't focus on any of it. Her mind was still racing, still replaying the moment when she had slapped the table, shouted at the elderly man, and forced him to move. She had won, but it felt like a Pyrrhic victory, a hollow one that had left her with nothing but regret. And then, without thinking, she stood up. The movement was sudden, driven by an instinct she couldn't fully explain, but before she knew it, Karen was walking toward the elderly man's table. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step bringing her closer to him in the moment of confrontation she knew she had to face. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say, but she knew that she had to make amends, that the shame she felt in her chest wouldn't go away unless she tried to right the wrong she had done. As she reached his table, the elderly man looked up, his face still calm, his coffee cup now empty. I'm sorry, Karen said, her voice low and hesitant, her words coming out in a rush. I shouldn't have treated you like that. I was wrong. I let my frustration get the best of me, and I'm sorry for making you feel like you didn't belong here. Her words felt awkward, unfamiliar, but they were sincere. For the first time that morning, she wasn't focused on herself. She wasn't focused on the table, on the space she had lost, but on the person she had wronged. The elderly man looked up at her, his expression softening as he took in her apology. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded slowly, as if accepting her words without the need for further explanation. There was no anger in his eyes, no trace of the frustration Karen had expected. Instead, there was only understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that she had made a mistake and was trying to fix it. He smiled faintly and said simply, "It's all right, dear. We all get frustrated sometimes. I'm just here to enjoy my coffee, just like you." The weight in Karen's chest seemed to lift slightly, the heavy feeling of guilt and shame easing just a little. She didn't know what to say next, but the moment of confrontation was over. She had done what she needed to do. She had apologized, and the man had accepted it with grace and dignity. As she turned to walk back to her seat, Karen realized that, in the end, the small victory she had sought from reclaiming her seat hadn't mattered at all. The true victory lay in the humility to recognize when she had been wrong and the courage to make it right.